In the shadowy world of Cold War espionage, few operations exemplify the dangerous intersection of unchecked government power and human rights violations as starkly as Operation Midnight Climax. This CIA program, which operated from 1954 to 1965, represents one of the most disturbing chapters in American intelligence history, a time when the fear of communist mind control techniques led the United States government to conduct illegal experiments on its own citizens. Operation Midnight Climax was not an isolated incident, but rather a sub-project of the larger MKUltra program, the CIA's extensive mind control research initiative that began in the 1950s. While MKUltra encompassed numerous unethical experiments, Operation Midnight Climax stands out for its particularly egregious methods. The use of CIA-operated brothels to dose unsuspecting men with LSD, while government agents observed and recorded their behavior from behind one-way mirrors. Understanding this operation requires examining not just the mechanics of what happened, but the broader context of Cold War paranoia, the culture of secrecy that enabled such abuses, and the eventual exposure that led to crucial reforms in government oversight. The story of Operation Midnight Climax is ultimately a cautionary tale about what happens when intelligence agencies operate without proper accountability, and how the pursuit of national security can lead to the violation of the very principles a democracy seeks to protect. The roots of Operation Midnight Climax can be traced to the early years of the Cold War, when American intelligence officials became increasingly concerned about Soviet and Chinese capabilities in psychological warfare. The catalyst for these fears came from disturbing reports emerging from the Korean War, where American prisoners of war appeared to have been subjected to sophisticated brainwashing techniques. On April 10, 1953, Allen Dulles, the newly appointed director of the CIA, delivered a speech to Princeton alumni that would foreshadow the dark path American intelligence was about to take. Dulles spoke of the battle for men's minds and warned of Soviet brain perversion techniques that he described as effective but abhorrent and nefarious. He gestured to American POWs returning from Korea, describing them as shells of the men they once were, parroting the communist propaganda they had heard cycled for weeks on end. This paranoia was further fueled by the 1949 show trial of Hungarian Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty in Budapest. CIA officials observed the cardinal's vacant gaze and trance-like behavior, becoming convinced that his confession had been extracted through chemical means. The specter of communist mind control techniques created a sense of urgency within the intelligence community. If the Soviets had such capabilities, the United States needed to develop them as well. In response to these perceived threats, Dulles approved Project MKUltra in 1953. The covert operation aimed to develop techniques that could be used against Soviet bloc enemies to control human behavior with drugs and other psychological manipulators. The program was granted 6% of the CIA's operating budget in 1953, without oversight or accounting. An estimated $10 million or more was spent on these experiments. MKUltra was led by Sidney Gottlieb, a CIA chemist who served as chief of the chemical division of the Office of Technical Service. Gottlieb was a brilliant but deeply troubled individual who became convinced that the future of espionage lay in chemical and psychological manipulation. In the early 1950s, he arranged for the CIA to spend $240,000 to purchase the world's entire supply of LSD, which he brought back to the United States from Europe and distributed to various research programs secretly sponsored by the CIA in hospitals, clinics, and prisons. The scope of MKUltra was vast and varied, and the program involved more than 150 human experiments involving psychedelic drugs, paralytics, and electroshock therapy. Sometimes the test subjects knew they were participating in a study, but at other times they had no idea, even when the hallucinogens started taking effect. Many of the tests were conducted at universities, hospitals, or prisons in the United States and Canada, with researchers often unaware that their funding came from the CIA. Into this world of psychological experimentation stepped George Hunter White, a federal narcotics agent who would become the operational head of Operation Midnight Climax. White was a complex figure, a decorated World War II veteran who had served in the Office of Strategic Services (OSS), the CIA's predecessor organization. His wartime experiences had given him a taste for unconventional warfare and a willingness to operate in moral gray areas. White's background made him an ideal candidate for Sidney Gottlieb's purposes. He had experience with undercover work, a network of contacts in the criminal underworld, and a personality that seems suited to the morally ambiguous world of intelligence operations. Perhaps most importantly, he had few scruples about the methods he employed in service of what he saw as the greater good. In 1952, White was working as a Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent when he was recruited by Gottlieb to join the MK-Ultra program. His initial assignment was to test the effectiveness of LSD as a truth serum, building on his previous experience with more traditional interrogation techniques. White's early experiments took place in a safe house in New York City, where he would dose subjects with LSD and observe their behavior. The results of these early experiments were mixed at best. While LSD certainly altered the subject's consciousness, it did not produce the reliable truth-telling effects that Gottlieb and his colleagues had hoped for. In fact, the drug often made subjects more paranoid and less likely to reveal sensitive information. However, rather than abandoning the program, Gottlieb decided to expand it, and White was given broader authority to experiment with different methods and settings. White's personality was well suited to this work, though not necessarily in ways that reflected well on his character. He was described by colleagues as someone who enjoyed the power and excitement of his unusual assignment. In a letter to Gottlieb written years later, White would candidly describe his enthusiasm for the work. "Of course I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill and cheat, steal, deceive, rape and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" This attitude would prove to be emblematic of the casual disregard for human rights and dignity that characterized Operation Midnight Climax. White and his colleagues had convinced themselves that the ends justified the means, and that any method was acceptable if it served the cause of national security. Before Operation Midnight Climax could be fully implemented, the MK-Ultra program was shaken by a tragedy that would have lasting implications for how the experiments were conducted. In November 1953, Dr. Frank Olson, a civilian scientist working for the Army's Special Operations Division, attended a CIA retreat at Deep Creek Lodge in rural Maryland. During the retreat, Olson was given a drink that had been secretly spiked with LSD. The dosing was conducted without his knowledge or consent, as part of an experiment to test the drug's effects on unsuspecting subjects. Olson's reaction to the LSD was severe. He became increasingly paranoid and agitated, displaying symptoms of what would now be recognized as a psychotic episode. A few days later, on November 28, 1953, Olson was found dead after falling from the window of his hotel room in New York City. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but the circumstances were suspicious from the beginning. Olson had been accompanied to New York by Dr. Robert Lashbrook, a CIA operative who was in the room when Olson died but claimed to have been asleep at the time. The Olson case became a lasting source of controversy and suspicion. In 1975, the Olson family received a $750,000 settlement from the U.S. government and formal apologies from President Gerald Ford and CIA Director William Colby, though their apologies were limited to informed consent issues concerning Olson's ingestion of LSD. However, the family remained convinced that Olson had been murdered rather than having committed suicide. In 1994, the Olson family had Frank Olson's body exhumed for a forensic examination. The analysis revealed evidence that contradicted the official suicide story. Olson's skull showed signs of blunt force trauma that appeared to have occurred before his fall from the window. This evidence led the family to file a federal lawsuit against the U.S. government, alleging that Olson had been the victim of assassination rather than suicide. While the case was ultimately dismissed due to the statute of limitations and a prior settlement agreement, the judge noted in his opinion that the public record supports many of the allegations in the case. The New York District Attorney's Office reopened the case and changed the cause of death from suicide to unknown. The Olson tragedy had immediate implications for the MK-Ultra program. The death of a government scientist under such suspicious circumstances created a potential public relations disaster for the CIA. In response, the agency implemented new protocols for its drug experiments, though these were largely cosmetic changes that did little to address the fundamental ethical problems with the program. More significantly, the Olson case led to a temporary suspension of MK-Ultra operations while the CIA conducted an internal review. However, rather than ending the program, this review resulted in its expansion and the development of new methods for testing drugs on unwitting subjects. It was during this period that Sidney Gottlieb and George Hunter White developed the concept that would become Operation Midnight Climax. With the MK Ultra program back in operation following the Olson incident, Sidney Gottlieb decided to relocate George Hunter White from New York to San Francisco. The move was partly motivated by practical considerations. San Francisco's more permissive atmosphere and diverse population made it an ideal location for the kind of experiments Gottlieb had in mind. But it was also driven by a desire to distance the program from the East Coast, where the Olson case had attracted unwanted attention. In 1955, White established a new safe house at 225 Chestnut Street on Telegraph Hill, one of San Francisco's most prestigious neighborhoods. The location was chosen carefully. It offered sweeping views of San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz, and the Bay Bridge, creating an atmosphere of luxury and sophistication that would appeal to the kind of clients White intended to attract. The apartment itself was a spacious, 6-bedroom duplex that White transformed into what can only be described as a sophisticated surveillance operation disguised as a bordello. He decorated the rooms with prints by Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, creating an atmosphere that was both artistic and slightly decadent. The furniture was carefully chosen to create an environment that would be appealing to potential subjects while also facilitating the covert observation that was central to the operation. The most important features of the safe house were the surveillance systems that White installed throughout the building. The wall mirrors were not merely decorative, they were one-way portals through which CIA agents could observe everything that happened in the rooms. Recording devices were hidden in electrical outlets, allowing conversations to be captured and analyzed later. White even installed a small refrigerator and portable toilet in the observation room so that he could monitor activities without interruption. The safe house operation was designed to appear as a high-end brothel, complete with attractive women who were recruited specifically for their ability to attract clients and their willingness to participate in the experiments. These women were not typical prostitutes. They were carefully selected and trained by White to serve the CIA's purposes. In exchange for their cooperation, they received immunity from prosecution for any illegal activities they might be involved in. A powerful incentive given the legal risks associated with prostitution at the time. The operation at 225 Chestnut Street was remarkably sophisticated for its time. White had essentially created a controlled environment where he could observe human behavior under the influence of various psychoactive substances while maintaining the cover of a legitimate business. The subjects who visited the safe house had no idea that they were participating in a government experiment. They believed they were simply patronizing an upscale brothel. The actual operation of the Midnight Climax program was both methodical and deeply disturbing. The process began with the recruitment of suitable subjects, typically men who were visiting San Francisco for business or pleasure, and who were unlikely to be missed if they experienced unusual side effects from their encounter. The women working at the safe house were instructed to approach potential subjects in bars, restaurants, and other public places around San Francisco. They were trained to identify men who appeared to be visitors to the city, particularly those who seemed to have money and who might be interested in a discreet encounter. The women would strike up conversations with these men, gradually steering the discussion toward the possibility of a private meeting. Once a subject had been identified and recruited, he would be brought to the safe house on Chestnut Street. The environment was designed to put subjects at ease. The luxurious surroundings, the sophisticated atmosphere, and the attractive women all served to create a sense of security and comfort. Subjects were typically offered drinks as soon as they arrived, and it was in these drinks that the LSD and other psychoactive substances were administered. The dosing was done without the subject's knowledge or consent. The women had been trained to administer the drugs in such a way that the subjects would not detect any unusual taste or effects until it was too late. The amount of LSD given to each subject varied, but it was typically enough to produce significant alterations in consciousness and behavior. Once the drugs began to take effect, the real purpose of the operation became clear. The women were instructed to engage the subjects in conversation, attempting to extract information about their personal lives, their work, and any secrets they might be willing to reveal. The goal was to determine whether the combination of LSD and sexual arousal might make subjects more likely to disclose sensitive information. From the observation room, White and his colleagues would watch and listen to everything that transpired. They took detailed notes on the subject's behavior, their responses to questions, and any information they revealed. The sessions were often recorded, both audio and video, creating a permanent record of the experiments. The subjects' experiences varied widely depending on their individual reactions to the drugs and their personal circumstances. Some became extremely talkative and willing to discuss personal matters they would normally keep private. Others became paranoid and suspicious, making it difficult for the women to extract any useful information. Still others simply became confused and disoriented, unable to engage in coherent conversation. What made the operation particularly disturbing was the complete lack of consent on the part of the subjects. These men had no idea that they were being drugged, that they were being observed, or that they were participating in a government experiment. They believed they were engaged in a private, consensual encounter with a prostitute, not realizing that every aspect of their experience was being manipulated and recorded by intelligence agents. The psychological impact on the subjects was often severe. Many experienced lasting trauma from their encounters, suffering from paranoia, anxiety, and other psychological symptoms long after the drugs had worn off. Some subjects reported feeling that they had been poisoned or that they were losing their minds. The fact that they had no explanation for what had happened to them only added to their distress. As Operation Midnight Climax continued, the scope of the experiments expanded beyond the original safe house on Chestnut Street. White established additional facilities in San Francisco and Marin County, as well as a similar operation in New York City. The program also began to experiment with different drugs and different methods of administration. The expansion of the program was driven partly by the CIA's desire to gather more data on the effectiveness of various psychoactive substances, but it was also motivated by the enthusiasm of the agents involved. White and his colleagues had become convinced that they were engaged in vital work for national security, and they were eager to explore new possibilities for their research. The additional safe houses operated on the same basic model as the original facility, but each had its own unique characteristics. Some were designed to attract different types of subjects, businessmen, tourists, or members of particular ethnic or social groups. Others were used to test different drugs or different methods of observation and data collection. The program also began to move beyond the controlled environment of the safe houses. White and his colleagues started dosing subjects in restaurants, bars, and other public places around San Francisco. They would slip LSD into drinks or food, then follow the subjects to observe their behavior in more natural settings. This expansion of the program greatly increased the number of people who were unknowingly subjected to the experiments. The casual attitude toward human subjects that characterized the program is perhaps best illustrated by the fact that CIA agents themselves often participated in the experiments. White and his colleagues would take LSD themselves, partly to better understand its effects and partly for recreational purposes. The line between scientific research and personal entertainment had become completely blurred. The program also began to include subjects who were particularly vulnerable to exploitation. Children, mentally ill patients, and prisoners were all subjected to experiments without their knowledge or consent. The use of these vulnerable populations represented a particularly egregious violation of basic ethical principles, but it was justified by the agents involved as necessary for the advancement of national security. One of the most disturbing aspects of Operation Midnight Climax was the complete absence of ethical oversight or accountability. The agents involved in the program operated with virtual impunity, convinced that their work was too important to be constrained by normal moral or legal considerations. This culture of impunity was fostered by several factors. First, the extreme secrecy of the program meant that very few people knew what was happening, and those who did were bound by security oaths that prevented them from speaking out. Second, the Cold War atmosphere created a sense of urgency and moral flexibility that made extreme measures seem justified. Third, the hierarchical structure of the CIA meant that lower-level agents could defer moral responsibility to their superiors, while those superiors could claim that they were only following orders from above. The agents involved in Operation Midnight Climax had convinced themselves that they were engaged in patriotic work that justified any means necessary. They saw themselves as protectors of national security who were willing to make moral sacrifices for the greater good. This self-justification allowed them to engage in activities that they would have found abhorrent in any other context. The lack of oversight also meant that the program gradually escalated in scope and severity. What began as relatively limited experiments with LSD evolved into a comprehensive program of psychological manipulation and abuse. The agents involved became increasingly cavalier about the rights and welfare of their subjects, treating them as objects to be studied rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect. The culture of impunity was also reflected in the way the program was documented and managed. While the agents took detailed notes on their experiments, They made little effort to ensure the safety or welfare of their subjects. There were no protocols for dealing with subjects who had adverse reactions to the drugs, no procedures for providing medical care, and no mechanisms for subjects to report problems or seek help. This ethical vacuum had lasting consequences not only for the subjects of the experiments, but also for the agents involved. Many of the CIA personnel who participated in Operation Midnight Climax later expressed regret about their involvement, acknowledging that they had crossed lines that should never have been crossed. The program left a lasting stain on the CIA's reputation and contributed to a broader crisis of confidence in American intelligence agencies. By the early 1960s, Operation Midnight Climax had been running for nearly a decade, and the program had expanded far beyond its original scope. However, the very success of the program in avoiding detection was beginning to create problems. The lack of oversight and accountability that had allowed the program to flourish was also making it increasingly difficult to control and manage. The first serious challenge to the program came from within the CIA itself. In 1963, John Ehrman, the agency's Inspector General, conducted a comprehensive review of the MK-Ultra program and its various sub-projects. Ehrman's investigation was prompted by growing concerns about the cost and effectiveness of the program, as well as questions about its legal and ethical implications. The Inspector General's report on MK-Ultra and Operation Midnight Climax was a damning indictment of the program. Ehrman found that the experiments had produced little useful intelligence, had violated numerous laws and regulations, and had put the CIA at risk of serious legal and political consequences. He strongly recommended that the program be terminated immediately and that all records be destroyed to prevent future embarrassment. The report highlighted several specific problems with Operation Midnight Climax. First, it noted that the program had failed to produce any reliable methods for extracting information from unwilling subjects. The combination of LSD and sexual arousal had not proven to be an effective truth serum, and many subjects had become more paranoid and less cooperative rather than more talkative. Second, the report raised serious questions about the legal status of the program. The use of illegal drugs, the operation of brothels, and the non-consensual experimentation on human subjects all violated federal and state laws. The CIA had no legal authority to conduct such experiments, and the agents involved could potentially face criminal prosecution. Third, the report criticized the lack of scientific rigor in the program. The experiments were poorly designed, the data collection was haphazard, and the results were not properly analyzed or documented. From a scientific standpoint, the program had produced very little valuable information despite years of effort and significant expense. The Inspector General's report also revealed the extent to which the program had spiraled out of control. What had begun as a limited experiment with LSD had evolved into a comprehensive program of psychological manipulation that included the use of numerous drugs, the operation of multiple safe houses, and the involvement of dozens of agents and contractors. The program had become an end in itself rather than a means to a specific intelligence objective. Despite the Inspector General's strong recommendations, the termination of Operation Midnight Climax was not immediate. The program had developed powerful advocates within the CIA, including Sidney Gottlieb and other senior officials, who were reluctant to abandon years of investment in the project. There was also concern that shutting down the program too abruptly might attract unwanted attention and raise questions about what had been happening. The shutdown process began in 1963 with the scaling back of operations at the safe houses. The San Francisco facilities were gradually reduced in size and scope, with some activities being transferred to other locations or discontinued entirely. However, the program continued to operate in a limited capacity for several more years. The final closure of the San Francisco safe houses came in 1965, when the CIA officially terminated Operation Midnight Climax. The New York facility was closed the following year, bringing the program to a complete end. However, the termination of the program was kept secret, and the public would not learn of its existence for another decade. The shutdown of Operation Midnight Climax was part of a broader scaling back of the MK-Ultra program during the mid-1960s. Changing political circumstances, growing concerns about legal liability, and the lack of productive results all contributed to the decision to end these experiments. However, the CIA's approach to the shutdown was characteristic of the secrecy and deception that had marked the program from its inception. Rather than conducting a thorough review of what had happened and taking steps to prevent similar abuses in the future, the CIA simply tried to make the program disappear. Records were destroyed, personnel were reassigned, and the whole episode was treated as if it had never occurred. This approach would prove to be short-sighted when the program was eventually exposed to public scrutiny. One of the most controversial aspects of the MKUltra program was the systematic destruction of records that occurred in 1973. This destruction was ordered by CIA Director Richard Helms, who was concerned about the potential for embarrassment if the program's activities were ever exposed to public scrutiny. The destruction of records was comprehensive and systematic. Helms ordered the elimination of all documents related to MKUltra and its various sub-projects, including Operation Midnight Climax. The goal was to ensure that no evidence remained that could be used to reconstruct the program's activities or identify the individuals who had been involved. The destruction order affected thousands of documents, including detailed records of individual experiments, financial records, personnel files, and correspondence between CIA officials. The loss of this documentation has made it impossible to fully understand the scope and impact of the program, and has prevented researchers and investigators from developing a complete picture of what happened. However, the destruction was not entirely successful. A cache of approximately 20,000 documents survived the purge because they had been incorrectly filed in a financial records building. These documents were discovered in 1977 following a Freedom of Information Act request, and they provided crucial evidence for subsequent congressional investigations. The surviving documents revealed the extent of the program's activities and the casual disregard for human rights that characterized its operations. They included detailed descriptions of experiments, financial records showing payments to contractors and subjects, and correspondence between CIA officials that demonstrated their awareness of the program's legal and ethical problems. The destruction of records was itself a significant crime, representing an obstruction of justice that compounded the original violations of the MKUltra program. The fact that the CIA's own director had ordered the destruction demonstrated the extent to which the agency was willing to go to protect itself from accountability. The first public exposure of the MKUltra program came through investigative journalism rather than government oversight. On December 22, 1974, New York Times reporter Seymour Hersh published a lengthy front-page article detailing covert CIA activities, including non-consensual drug experiments on American citizens. Hersh's article was based on information provided by sources within the intelligence community who had become concerned about the activities they had witnessed or participated in. The article revealed the existence of a systematic program of experimentation on human subjects, including the use of LSD and other psychoactive drugs. The publication of Hersh's article sent shockwaves through the American political establishment. The revelations came at a time when public trust in government was already at a low point due to the Watergate scandal and the Vietnam War. The idea that the CIA had been conducting illegal experiments on American citizens was deeply disturbing to many people and raised serious questions about the accountability of intelligence agencies. The article also prompted immediate denials and damage control efforts from the CIA and other government agencies. Officials claimed that the program had been terminated years earlier and that it had been conducted within legal boundaries. However, these denials were quickly undermined by additional revelations and evidence that emerged in the following months. The exposure of the MKUltra program was part of a broader pattern of revelations about intelligence abuses that emerged during the mid-1970s. These revelations included information about domestic surveillance programs, assassination plots against foreign leaders, and other activities that raised serious questions about the role and accountability of intelligence agencies in a democratic society. The revelations about MKUltra and other intelligence abuses prompted Congress to conduct its own investigation into the activities of American intelligence agencies. In January 1975, the Senate established the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, commonly known as the Church Committee, after its chairman, Senator Frank Church of Idaho. The Church Committee was given a broad mandate to investigate intelligence activities and determine the extent, if any, to which illegal, improper, or unethical activities were engaged in by any agency of the federal government. The committee was bipartisan in composition and included members with significant experience in foreign policy and intelligence matters. The investigation was comprehensive and thorough. Over the course of 16 months, the committee held 126 full committee meetings, 40 subcommittee hearings, and interviewed some 800 witnesses in public and closed sessions. The committee also reviewed more than 110,000 documents, including many that had survived the 1973 destruction order. The Church Committee's investigation of MKUltra and Operation Midnight Climax revealed the full scope of the program's activities and the extent of the violations that had occurred. The committee found that the program had involved non-consensual experimentation on thousands of subjects, including American citizens, and had violated numerous federal and state laws. The committee's findings were particularly damning with regard to the issue of informed consent. The committee concluded that prior consent was obviously not obtained from any of the subjects, and that the experiments had been conducted in violation of the Nuremberg Code, which the United States had agreed to follow after World War II. The Church Committee also found that the program had produced little useful intelligence, despite years of effort and significant expense. The committee concluded that the experiments had been poorly designed and executed, and that the results had not justified the human cost or the legal risks involved. In addition to the congressional investigation, President Gerald Ford established his own commission to investigate CIA activities within the United States. The United States President's Commission on CIA Activities within the United States, commonly known as the Rockefeller Commission after its chairman, Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, was tasked with examining whether the CIA had engaged in illegal domestic activities. The Rockefeller Commission's investigation was more limited in scope than the Church Committee's, focusing specifically on domestic activities rather than the full range of intelligence operations. However, the Commission did examine the MKUltra program and Operation Midnight Climax as part of its review of CIA activities within the United States. The Commission's findings were consistent with those of the Church Committee, confirming that the CIA had engaged in illegal and unethical experimentation on American citizens. The Commission found that the program had violated federal and state laws, had operated without proper oversight, and had caused significant harm to the individuals who had been subjected to the experiments. The Rockefeller Commission also examined the institutional factors that had allowed the program to operate without detection for so many years. The Commission found that the CIA had operated with insufficient oversight from Congress and the executive branch, and that the culture of secrecy within the agency had prevented proper accountability. While the congressional investigations and government reports provided important information about the scope and mechanics of Operation Midnight Climax, they could not fully capture the human cost of the program. The individuals who were subjected to the experiments suffered lasting psychological and emotional trauma that continued long after the program ended. The victims of Operation Midnight Climax faced several challenges in seeking recognition and compensation for the harm they had suffered. First, many of them had no idea that they had been subjects of government experiments. They knew that they had experienced something unusual and disturbing, but they did not understand what had happened to them or why. Second, the destruction of records made it difficult for victims to prove that they had been subjected to the experiments. Without documentation of their participation in the program, it was challenging for them to establish their legal rights or to seek compensation for the harm they had suffered. Third, the passage of time made it difficult for victims to connect their symptoms and problems to their experiences in the program. Many victims suffered from anxiety, depression, paranoia, and other psychological problems for years after their involvement in the experiments. But they did not realize that these problems were connected to their exposure to LSD and other drugs. Despite these challenges, some victims of Operation Midnight Climax have come forward to share their stories and seek justice. Their accounts provide a powerful reminder of the human cost of the program and the lasting impact of government abuse of power. One common theme in victims' accounts is the sense of betrayal and violation they felt when they learned about the program. Many victims had trusted their government to protect them, and the discovery that government agents had deliberately harmed them was deeply traumatic. This sense of betrayal was often compounded by the difficulty they faced in getting official recognition of what had happened to them. Another common theme is the lasting psychological impact of the experiments. Many victims reported suffering from anxiety, depression, and other mental health problems that they traced back to their experiences in the program. Some victims also reported physical health problems that they believed were connected to their exposure to LSD and other drugs. The victims' stories also highlight the broader social and political impact of the program. The revelation that the government had conducted illegal experiments on its own citizens contributed to a broader crisis of confidence in American institutions that continues to this day. The program served as a powerful reminder of the potential for government abuse of power and the importance of maintaining strong oversight and accountability mechanisms. The exposure of Operation Midnight Climax and the broader MK Ultra program led to significant reforms in the way intelligence agencies operate and are overseen. These reforms were designed to prevent similar abuses from occurring in the future and to ensure that intelligence activities are conducted within legal and ethical boundaries. One of the most important reforms was the establishment of permanent congressional oversight committees for intelligence activities. The Church Committee investigation had demonstrated the need for ongoing congressional supervision of intelligence agencies, and in 1976, the Senate established the Select Committee on Intelligence to provide that oversight. The House established a similar committee the following year. These oversight committees were given broad authority to review intelligence activities and to ensure that they comply with legal and ethical standards. The committees have the power to review budgets, examine operations, and investigate allegations of misconduct. They also have access to classified information and can conduct closed hearings when necessary to protect sources and methods. Another important reform was the establishment of clearer legal frameworks for intelligence activities. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FUSA of 1978, established procedures for conducting surveillance on foreign agents and terrorists, while other legislation clarified the legal boundaries for intelligence operations, both domestically and internationally. The reforms also included changes within the intelligence agencies themselves. The CIA established new procedures for reviewing and approving covert operations, including requirements for legal and ethical review. The agency also created new positions for oversight and compliance, including Inspector General offices that are responsible for investigating allegations of misconduct. Perhaps most importantly, the reforms established the principle that intelligence activities must be conducted within the bounds of law and with proper oversight. The idea that national security justifies any means, which had been central to the MK Ultra program, was explicitly rejected in favor of a more balanced approach that recognizes both the need for effective intelligence and the importance of protecting civil liberties. The story of Operation Midnight Climax remains relevant today as the United States continues to grapple with questions about the balance between national security and civil liberties. The program serves as a powerful reminder of what can happen when intelligence agencies operate without proper oversight and accountability. The contemporary relevance of the program has been highlighted by recent debates about surveillance, interrogation techniques, and other intelligence activities. The revelations about NSA surveillance programs by Edward Snowden in 2013 sparked renewed interest in the Church Committee and its findings, with many observers drawing parallels between the abuses of the 1970s and contemporary intelligence activities. The debate over enhanced interrogation techniques used in the War on Terror has also drawn comparisons to the MK Ultra program. Critics have argued that the use of psychological pressure, sensory deprivation, and other techniques represents a return to the kind of experimental approach that characterized Operation Midnight Climax. These debates have highlighted the continuing tension between the desire for effective intelligence and the need to maintain ethical standards. The program also remains relevant as a case study in the importance of oversight and accountability. The reforms that followed the Church Committee investigation have generally been successful in preventing similar large-scale abuses, but they require constant vigilance and periodic renewal to remain effective. The story of Operation Midnight Climax serves as a reminder of what can happen when these safeguards are weakened or ignored. One of the most significant aspects of Operation Midnight Climax was its flagrant violation of established ethical principles for human experimentation. The program was conducted in direct violation of the Nuremberg Code, a set of ethical principles for human experimentation that was established following the Nazi medical experiments during World War II. The Nuremberg Code established 10 principles for ethical human experimentation, and with the first and most important being the requirement for voluntary consent. The code states that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential, and that subjects must have legal capacity to give consent and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved. Operation Midnight Climax violated virtually every principle of the Nuremberg Code. The subjects were not informed that they were participating in an experiment. They did not give their consent, and they were not protected from harm. The experiments were not conducted by qualified scientists. The results were not properly documented, and there was no mechanism for subjects to withdraw from the study. The Church Committee investigation explicitly noted these violations, concluding that the experiments had been conducted in violation of principles that the United States had agreed to follow after World War II. This finding was particularly damaging because it suggested that American intelligence agencies had adopted methods that were associated with Nazi medical experiments. The violation of the Nuremberg Code had lasting implications for the regulation of human experimentation in the United States. The revelations about MK-Ultra and Operation Midnight Climax contributed to the development of new regulations and oversight mechanisms for research involving human subjects. The Department of Health and Human Services established institutional review boards (IRBs) to review and approve research proposals, and Congress passed legislation requiring informed consent for all research involving human subjects. These reforms have been largely successful in preventing similar abuses in the research community, though they have not eliminated all ethical problems. The legacy of Operation Midnight Climax continues to influence discussions about research ethics and the protection of human subjects. Operation Midnight Climax was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a broader pattern of government secrecy and lack of accountability that characterized the Cold War era. The program was possible because of the extraordinary secrecy that surrounded intelligence operations and the lack of effective oversight mechanisms. The extreme secrecy of the program meant that very few people knew what was happening, and those who did were bound by security oaths that prevented them from speaking out. This secrecy was justified by the need to protect national security, but it also created an environment where abuse was almost inevitable. The lack of accountability was also a crucial factor in enabling the program. The agents involved in Operation Midnight Climax operated with virtual impunity, knowing that their activities were unlikely to be discovered or investigated. This lack of accountability was reinforced by the hierarchical structure of the intelligence community, which discouraged questioning of orders or policies. The program also reflected the broader Cold War mentality that justified extreme measures in the name of national security. The fear of communist infiltration and mind control created an atmosphere where almost any method seemed justified if it could help protect the United States from its enemies. The exposure of Operation Midnight Climax and other intelligence abuses helped to change this culture of secrecy and lack of accountability. The reforms that followed the Church Committee investigation established new mechanisms for oversight and accountability, while also creating a presumption that intelligence activities should be conducted within legal and ethical boundaries. However, the tension between secrecy and accountability remains a central challenge in democratic societies. The story of Operation Midnight Climax serves as a reminder of the importance of maintaining strong oversight mechanisms and of the dangers of allowing national security concerns to override fundamental ethical principles. Beyond the ethical violations, Operation Midnight Climax was also a failure from a scientific standpoint. The program was presented as research into the effects of psychoactive drugs on human behavior, but it lacked the basic elements of legitimate scientific investigation. The experiments were poorly designed and lacked proper controls. There was no systematic method for selecting subjects, no standardized procedures for administering drugs, and no consistent method for measuring results. The conditions under which the experiments were conducted were highly artificial and bore little resemblance to real-world situations where the techniques might be used. The data collection was haphazard and unscientific. While the agents involved took notes on their observations, these were not systematic or standardized. The focus was on immediate operational concerns rather than long-term scientific understanding. The lack of proper documentation also made it impossible to replicate the experiments or to verify the results. The analysis of results was virtually non-existent. The program generated vast amounts of observational data, but this was never properly analyzed or synthesized. There was no systematic attempt to identify patterns or to draw conclusions about the effectiveness of different techniques or approaches. The absence of legitimate scientific methods was not accidental, but rather reflected the true purposes of the program. Operation Midnight Climax was not really about advancing scientific knowledge, but about developing operational capabilities for intelligence work. The scientific veneer was largely a justification for activities that were primarily motivated by other considerations. This scientific failure had important implications for the program's legacy. The lack of legitimate scientific results meant that the program had caused enormous harm to human subjects without producing any compensating benefits. The absence of proper scientific methods also made it difficult to assess the program's impact or to learn from its failures. While Operation Midnight Climax was primarily conducted in the United States, the broader MK-Ultra program had international dimensions that extended the scope of the abuses. Some of the most egregious violations occurred in Canada, where CIA-funded research was conducted at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. The Canadian experiments were conducted by Dr. Ewan Cameron, a psychiatrist who received CIA funding through front organizations. Cameron's experiments included the use of LSD, sensory deprivation, and electroshock therapy on psychiatric patients who had not consented to participate in research. Many of these patients suffered permanent psychological damage as a result of the experiments. The Canadian connection to MKUltra was particularly troubling because it demonstrated the willingness of the CIA to conduct experiments on foreign nationals and to use foreign institutions to circumvent legal and ethical restrictions that might apply in the United States. The use of Canadian facilities also helped to obscure the CIA's involvement in the research. The exposure of the Canadian experiments led to diplomatic tensions between the United States and Canada, as well as legal action by victims and their families. The Canadian government eventually acknowledged its role in facilitating the research and provided compensation to some victims. The international dimensions of MKUltra also raised questions about the regulation of research involving human subjects across national boundaries. The program demonstrated the need for international cooperation in establishing and enforcing ethical standards for human experimentation. The exposure of Operation Midnight Climax and the broader MKUltra program generated extensive media coverage and public reaction. The story had all the elements of a major scandal: government secrecy, illegal activities, and harm to innocent victims. The initial coverage by Seymour Hersh and other investigative journalists was crucial in bringing the story to public attention. These reporters faced significant challenges in investigating a highly classified program, but their persistence and dedication to uncovering the truth helped to ensure that the story was not suppressed or ignored. The media coverage of the church committee hearings was also important in educating the public about the scope and nature of the abuses. The televised hearings provided a forum for victims to tell their stories and for government officials to be held accountable for their actions. The public reaction to the revelations was generally one of shock and outrage. Many Americans were disturbed by the idea that their government had conducted illegal experiments on its own citizens, and the story contributed to a broader crisis of confidence in government institutions that characterized the post-Watergate era. The media coverage also helped to maintain public pressure for reforms and accountability, and the continued attention to the story made it difficult for government officials to dismiss the revelations or to avoid taking action to prevent similar abuses in the future. However, the media coverage also had some limitations. The complexity of the story and the classified nature of much of the information made it difficult for reporters to provide complete and accurate coverage. Some aspects of the story were sensationalized, while others were underreported or misunderstood. Operation Midnight Climax stands as one of the most disturbing examples of government overreach and human rights violations in American history. The program represents a dark chapter in the nation's past, when fear of foreign enemies and the pursuit of national security led to the abandonment of fundamental ethical principles and legal constraints. The story of Operation Midnight Climax offers several important lessons that remain relevant today. First, it demonstrates the dangers of operating intelligence agencies without proper oversight and accountability. The extreme secrecy that surrounded the program created an environment where abuse was almost inevitable, and the lack of accountability meant that those responsible faced no consequences for their actions. Second, the program shows the importance of maintaining strong ethical standards even in times of crisis. The Cold War atmosphere created pressures that led intelligence officials to justify extreme measures, but these pressures do not excuse the violations of human rights and dignity that occurred. The story serves as a reminder that ethical principles must be maintained even when they are inconvenient or difficult to uphold. Third, the program illustrates the crucial role of investigative journalism and congressional oversight in maintaining democratic accountability. The abuses of Operation Midnight Climax were exposed not through internal government oversight, but through the persistent efforts of journalists and congressional investigators who were willing to challenge the intelligence establishment. Fourth, the story demonstrates the importance of learning from past mistakes and implementing reforms to prevent similar abuses. The reforms that followed the Church Committee investigation have generally been successful in preventing similar large-scale abuses, but they require constant vigilance and periodic renewal to remain effective. Finally, the program serves as a reminder of the human cost of government abuse of power. The victims of Operation Midnight Climax suffered lasting psychological and emotional trauma that continued long after the program ended. Their stories provide a powerful reminder of why it is so important to maintain strong safeguards against government overreach. The legacy of Operation Midnight Climax continues to influence discussions about intelligence activities, research ethics, and the balance between national security and civil liberties. The program serves as a cautionary tale about what can happen when these fundamental principles are abandoned in the pursuit of other goals. As the United States continues to face new security challenges and technological developments that raise questions about privacy and civil liberties, the lessons of Operation Midnight Climax remain as relevant as ever. The story serves as a reminder that the protection of human rights and the maintenance of democratic accountability are not luxuries that can be abandoned in times of crisis, but rather fundamental principles that must be preserved at all costs. The men and women who were unknowingly subjected to the experiments of Operation Midnight Climax, deserve to be remembered, not just as victims, but as symbols of the importance of maintaining the ethical standards and legal protections that define a free society. Their suffering was not in vain if it helps to prevent similar abuses in the future and serves as a reminder of the constant vigilance required to protect human dignity and democratic values. In closing, Operation Midnight Climax represents both a failure of American institutions and a testament to their capacity for reform and renewal. The program's exposure led to significant changes in how intelligence agencies operate and are overseen, changes that have helped to prevent similar abuses. However, the story also serves as a reminder that these protections are not permanent and that each generation must work to maintain and strengthen them. The ultimate lesson of Operation Midnight Climax is that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, not just against foreign enemies, but against the tendency of government power to exceed its proper bounds. The story serves as a powerful reminder that in a democracy, the government must always be accountable to the people it serves, and that no cause, however noble, justifies the violation of fundamental human rights and dignity.